In the heart of the galaxy, the Tillian Empire stood as a symbol of power and wisdom. For centuries, they had thrived under the reign of their queen, whose counsel was sought far and wide. But now, a shadow loomed over this ancient empire. A rogue warlord, once a loyal servant, had risen with a fierce army, threatening to tear down everything the queen had built. Fear rippled through the empire, for the warlord was ruthless, and his forces unmatched. As the empire teetered on the edge of destruction, the queen convened her most trusted advisors. In the Tillian tradition, when the empire faced its greatest threat, a champion was chosen, an elite warrior, handpicked by the queen herself, to lead the forces into battle. For generations, the champion had always been one of their own, a Tillian of noble blood and proven strength. The weight of this decision pressed heavily on the queen, for her choice could determine the fate of millions. On the outskirts of the galaxy, far from the glittering cities and highborn warriors, lived Alexander Reed. A human, a veteran of Earth's wars, now a forgotten figure in the far reaches of space. He had seen things, survived battles that had left him broken and weary. Humans were a relatively new addition to the galactic stage, and though they had made their mark, they were often seen as lesser beings. Primitive, weak. The galaxy had little use for the wisdom and resilience of a human, especially in times of crisis. But Alexander, with his scarred past and quiet strength, had something few could see, a resolve forged in the fires of war. He had once led men into impossible battles, not for glory, but for survival. And it was this very quality, invisible to most, that had caught the queen's eye. Despite the prejudice humans faced, despite the empire's ingrained belief in their own superiority, the queen saw in Alexander a force that could not be denied. The day arrived when the queen would announce her choice. In the grand halls of the capital, the empire's greatest warriors gathered, each expecting to hear their name called. The anticipation was palpable. Whispers filled the air, each name debated, each warrior's merits weighed by the crowd. The finest of the Tillian elite stood tall, their reputations well-earned, their victories celebrated. Everyone knew the champion would come from their ranks. After all, it had always been so. And then, the queen spoke. She chose Alexander Reed. The shock was immediate. A human? Of all the great warriors, of all the noble bloodlines, she had chosen an outsider, a species barely recognized by the galaxy, a man whose name was unknown to most. The disbelief echoed through the halls. The council stood frozen, unable to comprehend the queen's decision. Murmurs of outrage spread quickly. How could she place the fate of the empire in the hands of a mere human? It was unthinkable. The political implications were immediate. Alien dignitaries, allies, and rivals alike questioned the queen's judgment. Some saw it as a sign of desperation, others as a grave mistake. The Tillian people, proud and traditional, could not understand how their queen could forsake their own for an outsider. There was talk of betrayal, whispers of rebellion. The galaxy itself watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to make of this unprecedented choice. But the queen, steadfast and calm, stood by her decision. In her wisdom, she had seen beyond bloodlines and tradition. She had seen something in Alexander that transcended the limitations of race and rank. She had seen a warrior whose spirit had not been broken, despite everything life had thrown at him. And in this moment of darkness, she knew that the empire needed not just a warrior, but someone who understood what it meant to fight when all seemed lost. Alexander, for his part, did not seek the role of champion. He had not asked for the mantle placed upon him. But when the queen called his name, when the eyes of the galaxy turned toward him, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had fought for many causes in his life, some noble, some futile. But this was different. This was about more than just survival. This was about honor, about proving that even the most underestimated could rise when the moment demanded it. As the galaxy reeled from the queen's decision, Alexander prepared to step into a world that was not his own. The warriors of the Tillian Empire would not welcome him. The political elite would question his every move. And the rogue warlord, waiting in the shadows, would be planning his next strike. But Alexander, with his quiet resolve, knew that the only way forward was through the fire. And if he was to lead this empire to victory, he would do it not as a human or as an outsider, but as the warrior the Queen had seen in him. In that moment, the fate of the Tillian Empire rested on the shoulders of a man the galaxy had forgotten. And in the silence that followed the Queen's shocking choice, a new chapter in the history of the galaxy began. The moment Alexander set foot in the heart of the Tillian Empire, he felt the weight of every gaze upon him. The air was thick with skepticism, and hostility seemed to hum beneath the surface. The Tillian military, renowned for its discipline and strength, stood rigid as he walked past, their eyes sharp and full of judgment. This was no place for a human, especially not one chosen as their champion. He was an outsider, a man from a world they considered backward and unworthy of their respect. Every step felt like walking into an arena, where the audience was waiting for him to fail. Despite his battle-hardened past, Alexander could feel the unspoken disdain. The soldiers whispered behind his back, their doubt palpable. They had trained their whole lives for this, to protect their empire and serve their queen, and yet she had chosen him, a human, someone who had no ties to their people, no understanding of their ways. In their eyes, it was an insult, a decision made in desperation or perhaps even madness. But Alexander did not flinch. He had faced worse than contempt in his life. War had taught him to keep moving, to let the weight of others' expectations slide off his shoulders. Still, this was different. This wasn't just about proving his worth on the battlefield. He was now a symbol of something much larger, something that both terrified and infuriated those around him. Late one evening, the Queen summoned him to her private chambers. Away from the prying eyes of the court, she spoke to him, her voice calm but filled with the gravity of her decision. She did not apologize for the storm her choice had caused. Instead, she offered him a glimpse into her true thoughts. This was not merely about his ability to fight. There were deeper forces at play, forces that even the Tillians, in all their ancient wisdom, did not fully understand. She spoke of an ancient prophecy, one that foretold the rise of a champion from beyond the stars, a figure who would not only save the Empire but also unlock a power long thought lost to time. The Queen believed that this prophecy was not just a legend, but a roadmap to the Empire's survival, and she saw in Alexander the qualities that no one else could see, qualities that connected him to that ancient past. The revelation weighed heavily on him. He had come here to fight, to prove himself, but now it seemed there was something more, something far beyond his comprehension. With the Queen's words echoing in his mind, Alexander threw himself into the grueling training that lay ahead. The Tillian elite warriors were unlike any soldiers he had ever encountered, fast, strong, disciplined to the point of perfection. At first, they watched him with cold detachment, as if waiting for the inevitable moment when he would fail. His human body, though toughened by years of war, was no match for their superior physicality. But what Alexander lacked in sheer power, he made up for in resourcefulness and cunning. He studied their movements, their strategies, adapting in ways they hadn't anticipated. His tactical mind, honed on Earth's battlefields, saw patterns they had overlooked, vulnerabilities they didn't know existed. Slowly, the warriors who had once scorned him began to take notice. They didn't say it outright, but there was a shift in the air. His resilience, his refusal to give up despite the odds stacked against him, began to wear down their skepticism. One by one, some of the Tillian officers, those who had been the most vocal in their opposition, started to approach him. They didn't offer praise, but they asked questions, small, subtle inquiries about his tactics, his thoughts on their maneuvers. It was the first crack in the wall that separated him from them. In battle simulations, Alexander led small groups of soldiers, and though they still eyed him warily, they followed his lead. When they succeeded, their respect for him grew, begrudging as it was. Among them was Captain Zyler, a decorated warrior known for his cold, unyielding demeanor. He had been one of the loudest critics of the Queen's decision, yet over time, even he began to see something in Alexander that he hadn't before. It wasn't just the human's ability to adapt, or his clever strategies. It was something deeper, an indomitable will, a fire that hadn't dimmed, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Xyler, though not one to admit he was wrong, began to speak of Alexander with a quiet respect. It wasn't friendship, but it was a start. Alexander's reputation grew, not because he had forced it, but because he had earned it. Through sweat, pain, and sheer determination, he had begun to bridge the gap between himself and the warriors who had once seen him as nothing more than an outsider. Yet even as he earned their respect, he knew that acceptance was still far off. This was a battle he would have to fight every day, not just with his fists, but with his mind, his heart, and his unshakable belief in his own worth. The whispers of doubt still lingered, but they were no longer as sharp, no longer filled with the same venom. He had proven that he could stand beside them, and though they might never fully embrace him, they could no longer deny his place among them. He was, for better or worse, their champion now. And with the looming war drawing ever closer, there was no turning back. Alexander had earned his place, not through brute force, but through the one thing the Tillians had underestimated, his unyielding spirit. In the end, that was what mattered most. As the days passed, Alexander found himself spending more time in the Queen's presence. Their conversations had shifted from military strategies and preparations for war to deeper, more personal topics. The Queen, usually reserved and enigmatic, seemed to see something in Alexander that went beyond his role as a warrior. It was during one of these conversations, in the stillness of her private chambers, that she revealed a truth that changed everything. The Queen spoke of a prophecy, one whispered through the ages, passed down only among the ruling line of the Tillian Empire. This prophecy spoke of a champion, not from within their own people, but from a distant world, someone who would rise in the Empire's darkest hour, wielding a power lost to time. This champion would not only save the Empire from destruction but also restore a force that had long been forgotten, a force tied to their ancient history. The Queen had long believed in the prophecy, and in Alexander, she saw the signs of its fulfillment. The weight of this revelation struck Alexander in a way no battle ever had. He had been chosen not just because of his skills or his past as a soldier, but because there was something about him that connected to the very roots of the Empire's history. He had always been an outsider, even among his own people, but now, he realized there was a deeper reason for that feeling. His life, seemingly by chance, had led him here, and now he was faced with the staggering possibility that his fate had always been intertwined with the destiny of the Tillian Empire. The Queen's words stirred something deep within him, something that had long been dormant. As he sought to understand what this prophecy meant, he began to investigate his own past, piecing together fragments of forgotten family lore and old stories. Slowly, a picture began to form, one that linked him to a time long before the Tillian Empire had even encountered humanity. His ancestors, it seemed, were not entirely human. There had been a forgotten union, generations ago, between a Tillian and a human, a bond that had given birth to a hybrid line that had since faded into obscurity. His very blood carried traces of this ancient connection, a legacy that made him more than just an ordinary man. He was part of something much larger, something that the galaxy itself had tried to erase. The realization unsettled him. He had come here thinking he was just another soldier, trying to prove himself in a galaxy that had no respect for humans. Now, he stood on the threshold of an ancient legacy, his bloodline tied to the fate of an empire he barely understood. And the Queen, she had known all along. Her choice had never been about simple strategy or politics. She had chosen him because she had seen the truth in him, a truth even he hadn't known. But as with all secrets, this one could not stay hidden forever. Whispers began to circulate within the court. The Queen's decision had already caused an uproar, but now, as word of Alexander's heritage began to leak, the political landscape grew even more dangerous. There were those within the court who had long sought to weaken the Queen's power, and Alexander's sudden rise was the perfect opportunity to strike. They questioned his loyalty, spread rumors that he was a threat to the Empire's stability, and planted seeds of doubt in the minds of those who had once supported the Queen. The tension in the court escalated quickly. Factions formed, some rallying behind the Queen and her chosen champion, while others plotted in the shadows, hoping to undermine her authority. Alexander, once merely a soldier trying to find his place, was now at the center of a political storm. His every move was scrutinized, every decision weighed for hidden motives. He could feel the eyes of the court on him, judging, waiting for him to falter. But it wasn't just political maneuvering that concerned him. As more people became aware of his heritage, Alexander felt the burden of his connection to the prophecy grow heavier. He had always believed his strength came from his human experiences, from the battles he had fought and survived. Now, he was faced with the knowledge that his true strength lay in something far more ancient and mysterious. This power that he had never known, this lost connection to the Tillian race, was both a gift and a curse. The question was, could he wield it without losing himself in the process? The Queen, for her part, remained steadfast in her decision. She had always known that the truth of Alexander's heritage would eventually come to light, but she had kept it hidden to protect him. She understood the dangers that came with being part of the prophecy. Enemies would emerge not just from outside the empire, but from within its very walls. Her motive had never been to deceive Alexander, but to shield him from the forces that would seek to destroy him before he could fulfill his destiny. Yet now, with the court in turmoil and the threat of civil unrest growing, the Queen had no choice but to reveal the full extent of her plan. She told Alexander that the prophecy was more than just a prediction of a foreign champion. It was a blueprint for the restoration of the Empire's greatest power, a force that had been lost for centuries, locked away by the ancestors of both the Tillians and humans. And Alexander, with his hybrid lineage, was the key to unlocking it. This revelation was both exhilarating and terrifying. The power that lay dormant within him was unlike anything he had ever imagined, but with it came great responsibility. The Queen knew that this power could save the Empire, but she also knew it could consume him if not carefully controlled. She had chosen him not just because of his skill as a warrior, but because she believed he was the only one who could balance the strength of the Tillian legacy with the resilience of his human spirit. As the forces of the rogue warlord grew ever closer, Alexander realized that the battle he was about to fight was not just for the survival of the Empire, it was for his own soul. The prophecy had set him on this path, but it was his choices that would determine how the story would end. The day the warlord's army appeared on the horizon, the skies over the Tillian capital darkened with dread. From the walls of the city, the sheer size of the invading force was impossible to ignore. Massive war machines and soldiers stretching far beyond the eye could see. It was clear that the warlord had thrown everything he had into this assault, determined to crush the Tillians and seize control of the Empire. The air crackled with the anticipation of inevitable bloodshed, and for the first time in centuries, the Tillian people tasted fear. Inside the city, the mood was grim. The military, though proud and disciplined, could not hide the worry in their eyes. They were outnumbered, and every strategic advantage they had once held seemed to crumble in the face of this overwhelming force. Even the seasoned officers who had seen countless battles knew that this could be the Empire's last stand. Whispers of defeat spread among the ranks, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the warlord's victory was a foregone conclusion. But Alexander stood firm. In the face of impending disaster, he did not waver. While others saw only doom, his mind raced with possibilities. He had fought in desperate battles before. On Earth, he had seen hopeless situations turned around by sheer grit and ingenuity. This would be no different, even if the scale was beyond anything he had ever faced. He knew that conventional tactics would not save them now. The Tillian army, though highly trained, was too rigid in its strategies, too reliant on their technological superiority, which the warlord's forces had already adapted to. What they needed was unpredictability, something the enemy had not prepared for. Taking command, Alexander quickly reorganized the forces. He broke them into smaller, more flexible units, allowing them to strike and retreat with a fluidity that confused the warlord's troops. His tactics drew from the guerrilla warfare he had learned on Earth, hit-and-run strikes, using the city's labyrinth of streets and corridors to his advantage. At first, the Tillians were skeptical, unaccustomed to such unorthodox methods, but as they began to see the results, their faith in him grew. The early skirmishes were brutal, but Alexander's strategies began to turn the tide. The warlord's army, expecting a frontal assault, was caught off guard by the sudden mobility and unpredictability of the Tillian forces. With each victory, the morale of the Tillians strengthened, but the reality of their situation remained grim. The warlord's army was vast, and for every victory, a dozen more enemies seemed to appear. The Tillian forces were tiring, their numbers dwindling, and the city's defenses were on the brink of collapse. As the battle raged on, Alexander could feel the weight of defeat pressing in. Despite all his efforts, the sheer scale of the enemy's army seemed insurmountable. He had given everything, and yet it was not enough. The warlord's forces continued to push forward, and the capital teetered on the edge of being overrun. In that moment, as the screams of battle filled the air and the ground shook beneath his feet, Alexander felt something deep within him stir. A power he had never fully understood, something ancient and primal, began to awaken. With the city on the brink of destruction, Alexander knew he had no choice but to tap into this hidden force, the one tied to his Tillian human heritage. He had resisted it for so long, fearing what it might do to him, but now there was no other option. Closing his eyes, he allowed the power to flood through him, feeling it surge like fire in his veins. The battlefield shifted. His senses sharpened, his strength magnified, and in that moment, he became something more than human, more than Tillian. The impact was immediate. As he led a daring counterattack, his movements became faster, more precise, as if time itself had slowed around him. He struck with a ferocity that left the enemy reeling, his mere presence on the battlefield sending shockwaves through the warlord's army. The Tillian forces, inspired by his newfound strength, rallied behind him, pushing back the invaders with a vigor they hadn't known they possessed. The warlord's forces, once so confident in their overwhelming numbers, were now stunned, confused by the sudden shift in the tide of battle. Alexander's leadership had been formidable before, but now, with this power unleashed, he was unstoppable. The Tillians surged forward, their hope renewed as they drove the warlord's forces from the city. But with each strike, each victory, Alexander felt something changing within him. The power that coursed through his veins was not without its price. As he embraced the ancient force, he could feel his humanity slipping away, piece by piece. His thoughts became colder, more distant, and the emotions that had once guided him now felt like distant echoes. The strength he had gained was intoxicating, but it was also consuming him, threatening to erase the very person he had once been. Even as the warlord's army faltered, Alexander struggled with the realization that this power was not just a gift, it was a burden. Every moment he used it, he felt less like himself, and more like a vessel for something far greater, something he could not control. The battlefield around him was a blur of victory and chaos, but inside, he was fighting a different battle, one that could cost him everything. In the end, the warlord's forces were broken, retreating in disarray as Alexander led the final charge. The Tillian capital was saved, and the empire, for the moment, had survived. But as the dust settled and the cheers of victory echoed through the streets, Alexander stood alone, grappling with the cost of what he had become. The power had saved them, but it had also taken something from him, something he feared he might never get back. The battle was over, but Alexander knew his struggle was just beginning. In the heart of the battlefield, with the capital in ruins around them, Alexander finally came face to face with the warlord. The enemy towered over him, brimming with arrogance and confidence in his impending victory. The warlord had built his empire on fear, crushing civilizations with brute force. He had never known defeat, and in his eyes, this human before him was nothing more than a distraction, a last, futile resistance from a doomed empire. But Alexander was no ordinary human anymore. The power coursing through him, ancient and raw, gave him an edge the warlord had never anticipated. Drawing on his tactical genius, he baited the warlord into a fight he thought he could win, luring him into a trap that played to his weaknesses. The clash was fierce, each strike calculated, each move precise. Alexander's mind, sharpened by years of combat, worked in perfect harmony with the primal force within him. With every blow, the warlord's confidence faltered. Alexander was faster, stronger, and more dangerous than any enemy he had ever faced. In a final, decisive moment, Alexander unleashed the full extent of his newfound abilities. It wasn't just his skill as a warrior that overwhelmed the warlord, it was the sheer, unstoppable force of the ancient power that flowed through him. The rogue faction crumbled, their leader brought to his knees, and with his defeat, the empire was saved. The warlord's reign of terror ended not with a roar, but with the quiet finality of a single, well-placed strike. Yet, even as victory washed over the Tillian forces, Alexander felt none of the triumph. The battle had been won, but at what cost? As the dust settled, he stood there, not as the man who had once been a soldier of earth, but something else entirely. The power that had granted him victory now felt like a cage, trapping him in a form that no longer felt human. Each time he had drawn on it, he had felt a part of himself slip away, memories, emotions, fragments of his identity, all fading into the abyss. The more he embraced his newfound strength, the more alien he became. The faces of the soldiers who had fought beside him blurred, their cheers of victory hollow in his ears. He could no longer connect with them, no longer feel the same camaraderie that had once defined his life. The ancient power had made him a hero, but it had also made him a stranger to his own soul. He wondered if he would ever find a way back to the man he had once been, or if he was doomed to remain this alien being, cut off from the humanity that had once grounded him. The Queen, ever watchful, approached him in the aftermath. Her gaze was not one of celebration but of understanding. She had known all along what this power would do to him, what it would cost. It was why humans had been kept out of galactic warfare for so long. The potential for power within them was far more dangerous than the galaxy had ever realized. They were not just warriors, they were catalysts for forces that could reshape entire civilizations. And with that power came a terrible price. She explained to Alexander that his transformation was more than just a consequence of his bloodline. The very nature of humanity, with its resilience and adaptability, made them uniquely suited to wield powers that other races could not. But that same adaptability also made them vulnerable to losing themselves in the process. The galaxy had feared human potential for this reason, and now Alexander was living proof of why. He had saved the Empire, but in doing so, he had become a warning, a reminder that some powers were too dangerous, even for those strong enough to wield them. With the warlord's defeat, the Tillian Empire emerged stronger than ever. Their victory had solidified their position in the galaxy, and for the first time, the other empires looked at them with a new respect. But it was not just the Tillians who had gained from this war. The galaxy had taken notice of humanity in a way it never had before. Alexander's victory had shown them what humans were truly capable of, and it had shifted the balance of power. No longer could humanity be dismissed as a weak and backward race. They had the potential to be far more than anyone had imagined, and that realization sent ripples through the galactic political landscape. But as Alexander stood on the brink of this new era, he found no peace in the knowledge of his triumph. He had reshaped the future, not just for the Tillians, but for humanity as well. Yet, he was left with the haunting question of what he had become. The ancient power had saved him, but it had also taken something from him that he could never get back. He was no longer the man who had once fought on Earth, no longer the human who had been chosen by the Queen. He was something else now, something in between, and he didn't know if he could ever reconcile the two. As the galaxy began to rebuild in the wake of the war, Alexander's future remained uncertain. The Empire celebrated him as a hero, but he knew that his journey was far from over. The path ahead was filled with questions, not just about his place in the galaxy, but about the nature of humanity itself. If humans were capable of such power, what would it mean for their future? Would they be a force for good, or would they fall victim to the same forces that had nearly consumed him? In the quiet moments after the battle, Alexander stood at the edge of the capital, looking out at the stars. The war had ended, but his struggle had only just begun. What lay ahead was unknown, but one thing was certain: the galaxy would never be the same again. And neither would he.